right, here we are, another episode of ShiftED podcast, coming to you out of Montreal today. Great guest. I'm not reaching that far. We're in Canada, staying in Canada, and just reaching over the Quebec-Ontario border. I have Garfield Gini-Newman with us today, and he's actually been doing some work with us in our system here in Quebec, and I was so pleased that he took me up on this offer. So thanks so much, Garfield, for joining me here today.
You're welcome. Delighted to be here.
Well, we're going to jump right in, but I kind of would love to just ask you a question of what got you into education to start this whole career of yours, this amazing career that you've had. What were the beginning seeds that started this growth in the educational world?
Well, actually, it's interesting you start with that question because September marked my 40th year in education. And I started when I was young as a high school teacher in York Region, north of Toronto, and taught for a number of years there. So I guess I just came out of university thinking teaching is what I would like to be involved in. And then probably 15 years down the road, I'd written a number of textbooks and a number of other things. And in the 90s, starting to emerge on the neuroscience of learning and how the brain learns. And that intrigued me. But then I was approached by Dr. Roland Case, who's actually originally from Montreal, who's the founder of the Critical Thinking Consortium. And we began to explore and work together. And at that point, I joined and became the senior consultant with the consortium about 20 some years ago.
Amazing. Well, and the ride continues on, doesn't it?
It does. And it's this fall we've been in Korea, in China, across Canada. This week alone, I'm in Montreal, Quebec City, and Brandon, Manitoba. So
wow.
It's all right.
Yeah, it's a lot of jetting around, that's for sure. And I mean, I imagine that the main, or some of your main topics that you're talking about now is this critical thinking and kind of looking through that lens when you're looking at your organization, but also your classroom as well. If I were to ask you, like, the first question is kind of, what is the thesis behind it? Like, if you had to kind of like condense it into a paragraph or so, the critical thinking is what?
Well, I'm actually going to broaden because, in the book on creating thinking classrooms, you'll notice in the title, interestingly, we don't use the word critical, and that was intentional in that we started to think about critical, creative, and collaborative thinking and realize that really we want to promote high quality thinking in classrooms. So that would be, as a starting point, it's quality thinking that we're interested in. I teach a graduate course at U of T in creativity and innovation. And one of the interesting things over the years has been coming to realize the intersection of critical thinking and creativity, that they're not separate ways of thinking. They both are rigorous and they both involve similar intellectual tools. And so really the thrust of the book is how do we promote good, rich thinking, which might be critical and or creative and collaborative. And so that's kind of the driver for the book and the thesis and the work is nurturing those. And the other piece I would say that has grown increasingly over the years is, aside from the rich critical thinking, how do we do this in a sustained inquiring approach? And that word sustained is increasingly important so that it's not a series of one-off prompts to think critically in isolation, but it's sustained depth over time.
Very interesting. And I was particularly attracted towards your chapter 3, where it was the critical, creative, and collaborative dimensions of thinking. Could you kind of explain the crossroads between, like, I kind of saw it as a Venn diagram a little bit where they do all intersect. Could you paint that line for us where those three come together?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. We played with the Venn diagram idea for a while as began to wonder. The problem is with the Venn diagrams, it still leaves part of creative outside of critical and critical outside creative.
Okay.
And we began thinking about that, thinking, is there a time when, for example, creative thought or critical thought aren't intersecting? And we began, thinking that is one a subset of the other, which one is the subset? But that line at the core, and it might be helpful to define, and then I can broaden from there, that critical thinking has four key dimensions that are really important. One is that there has to be a decision of some kind. It's an assessment, a judgment. There has to be an invitation to reach a decision of some kind. That decision, then, to have that decision out there have to be options to consider. There are options that I'm weighing to reach my decision. That decision is not just based on a preference, how I feel about something. It's based on a set of criteria. From the root, critical thinking comes from the Greek word meaning criterial thinking. Mm-hmm. And then I use evidence. Now, so that's at the core of all critical thinking. It's criterial-based thinking that has us weigh options to reach a thoughtful, reasoned judgment. But when we looked at creativity, it's still the same thing. The difference is in creativity, there's the fluency and flexibility of thinking to generate those options. So rather than options presented in the creative space, I have to generate those options. But creative activities still require that I decide, is this worth pursuing? Do I let it go? Do I need to revise it? And all those are criterial-based decisions. So we began to see that whether I'm nurturing critical, creative, or collaborative, there's still criteria guiding us. There's still a body of evidence you need to guide that. So at their core, this is why we said critical, creative, and collaborative are all quality thinking. By the way, one other quick piece: collaborative thinking, properly understood, is not cooperative. It's not you and I putting our heads together and having to reach the same conclusion. But collaborative is me having to decide what to take from my conversation that I see value and it makes sense for me. And so each of us are responsible for our own learning, but I benefit from engaging in that conversation. But at the end of the day, I need to reconcile that with my understanding. So what we began to see is that critical, creative, and collaborative are these kind of three-dimensional intersecting pieces, right, that mutually reinforce in our classrooms.
Okay, interesting. It's a great chapter, that one. It was one that I had to kind of go back and look at again too. And do you find that terms kind of like we're in education, there's always terms for so many different things. And we kind of like get the flavor of the month at times, a feeling where a new idea comes out, or research, and then a new thing, or UDL versus design thinking versus like, how do you approach a book and writing a book where you want certain concepts to definitely be at the forefront, but that it has this, like you said, something that sustains, like something that has legs to it. Like, how do you get from the kind of the macro to the micro in the critical thinking journey?
Chris, that's a really good question, because there's a danger, I think, always, in the kind of work that we do and that you do, and that how do we not just get caught up in like, I'm afraid that there are times when people, create a new catchword and now we're a guru because I invented that word. And so,
right.
I'm doing some writing for both New Brunswick right now and Manitoba governments on assessment. And, it's an example of where I'm saying we've created all this language we stumble over: assessment, for, of, and as, formative. Look, at the end of the day, you're either assessing to guide kids or you're evaluating, but we've created this complexity. We look at, well, what does engagement actually mean? Well, it comes from the French word to commit to. And so being engaged does not mean being more entertained. It doesn't mean having more fun. It means getting an intellectual commitment to the process of thinking. Mm-hmm. Or when we look at, to inquire, stripped right back to inquirers to seek answers. And so I can inquire, I asked you earlier, hey, will I see you on Wednesday? You said, yeah, well, okay, done. That's an inquiry, and I got an answer. Mm-hmm. So when schools say, oh, we teach through inquiry, well, that could still be you inquired, you found your answer. It doesn't mean there's deep thinking. So we try to return to the root of words and say, now let's work with the root of that word so we can have some clarity. And so that's often important. Now, there are some words, and this, we talk about a critical challenge, or we will talk about criteria for judgment. And those are to put a finer point on. And if I can just, very quickly, criteria, criteria can be either simply descriptive or they can be qualitative in nature. So there we add the word for judgment to say when people are using criteria, I had a gentleman taught woodworking and he said, my kids have to build a box. And my criteria is they have to use a particular, one of the three types of corners I teach them, they have to have a lid and it has to be certain dimensions.
Hmm.
Those are criteria, but they're descriptive. There's no judgment in that. They're binary. Either you did it or you didn't.
Right.
Those criteria for judgment would outline the qualities I'm looking for in that work. There is a thinking behind it. So sometimes the words are added to add clarity to what they're doing, what we're doing. And sometimes it's a matter of stripping back those words and reminding ourselves. I find teachers find it always enlightening when I remind them that the word assessment comes from the Latin word assedere, meaning to sit alongside. It doesn't mean to sit in judgment. It means to sit in guidance, to support.
Right.
So those are kind of two things that guide us in trying to not. I often go into places I'm working though and say, look, if there's language people are getting tripped up on, just tell me the language you're already using. We don't need to add more layers on that. So if you're using essential questions and I'm using a through-line question, then just let's decide on which one you want to use and not get caught up in language.
Absolutely. I like to, I heard this quote that you had said, and it does kind of simplify things for teachers instead of like another research, another word or another definition, where you said tweak and fortify was a foundation that we're not asking you to overhaul everything and throw the baby out with the bathwater here. We want you to reflect on what you're doing, tweak certain things, and then fortify. Could you expand on that thought? Because I thought it kind of like lessened my anxiety a little bit when I'm reading all of these different kind of like, oh, trying this and trying that, because we work with all school boards that learn, so we get bombarded with all the languages and all the different things that they're doing at their boards and stuff. But could you reflect a little bit on that tweaking and fortifying statement that you had made?
Sure. And first, I'm going to set that in context saying, and just today, talking with you, I said, look, there are two fundamental shifts we should be interested in. Two fundamental shifts. One, framing our questions so they invite kids to think. Right, so number one thing is, do my questions invite you to make a thoughtful decision? Have I invited thinking? Two, make the invitation to think where learning begins, not where it ends. Because so often people think I have to front-end load the content first, then I can ask you that rich question.
Right.
I'm saying, well, no, actually, you can invite kids to think, and then they can change their mind as they learn. So now that leads me to tweak and fortify. So the tweak is simply saying, can I, for example, add a single word that might put a more clear focus on the thinking that's being asked? And we call them qualifiers. So I could say, I want you to identify three arguments the author makes in their writing. Or I could ask you, what are the three most compelling arguments the author makes? The first one, I just go ahead and I find the first three and I write them down. I found three arguments, there I'm done. The second one, well, what do you mean by a compelling argument? What's the criteria that you're using? And I could say to you, well, Chris, you picked an interesting three. Can you talk to me about why you chose those three? Because someone else picked a different three. And both could be equally sound, but it's not the first three, it's the most compelling.
Right.
Asking young kids, why would the little red hen not share her bread? Well, that's a retrieval question. That's not a thinking question. It's just, I remember in the story. Was it fair that she wouldn't share her bread? Oh, well, I have to think about what makes something fair. Now I have to use the details from the story to support my decision about whether it was fair or not. Those are what we mean by tweaks. And often they be accomplished with simply adding one word to a question, best, instead of, what are three ways we can harvest trees? We ask, what are the best ways to harvest trees? Well, we pause and say, well, best by best, we mean it's sustainable, it's profitable, and it's safe, or whatever the criteria might be.
Sure.
That's the tweak part. The fortify part, sometimes we'll be talking with teachers and they got a really good question. That's a terrific question. Some grade 3 teachers today in the story Where the Wild Things Are. And the question they asked, was Max dreaming? Now, we tweak that a little more, just to make it a little stronger, saying, what's the most convincing evidence that Max was or was not dreaming in that story? Okay, so now it's not a retrieval. It's not remembering the story because they never actually say in the story, was he or not? But is it implied that he was? What evidence? Now, the fortify is adding what we call intellectual tools. You've got a great question, but if I don't have the background knowledge, I can't answer your question. So how do we build the background? Or help kids think about the criteria? Or provide a thinking organizer when they gather evidence? Do they have a way to sort and organize so they can see the patterns or make the connections? And I find with teachers, the tweak, they see, oh, this doesn't mean I have to rewrite my whole program. It's not a big rewrite. It's often a small but powerful little shift.
Yeah.
And the other side of it is, oh, adding that one tool in. And by the way, I have to say, for our kids who are struggling, going back to you asked earlier about the journey in this work, I want to tell you 20 years ago when I began, critical thinking was really what we did for the gifted program. It was IB program. And what we've found over time is teaching the intellectual tools for thinking is more important for our kids who struggle. Our kids who are strong tend to intuitively do some of these things already. Critical thinking is actually more and most important for our kids who might struggle. We give them some structure, we give them the tools they need. If they have the tools, they can more likely engage. So I'll just finish by saying, I always have to remind teachers, just asking better questions doesn't mean you get better answers. So I tweaked my question, but my kids still gave disappointing answers. Well, if you didn't build the toolkits they need, the background knowledge they draw on, the way to see the connections, you're not going to get better answers just because you ask better questions. And so that's the fortify. It's how do we add the tools that will help kids be successful?
Right. And you've talked about 5 intellectual tools, right? Like, can you ring those off and kind of like
Sure.
add a little color to them?
Yeah. So the first two we've kind of touched on, but the first two that are really the pillars are background knowledge. And we say background knowledge because you can't think in a vacuum. You can't think about nothing. And the second one is criteria for judgment. Those are the two pillars. But I have something to think about. I have some criteria to guide me in that thinking. I want to loop back to those. I'll give you the 5, and then I'll quickly come back.
Yep.
The third one is critical thinking vocabulary. And that one's looking at the language of thinking. And, I always have to remind teachers, not the language of your side. Pythagorean theorem is background knowledge. Metamorphosis, that's background knowledge. Analyze and evaluate is vocabulary of thinking. And if you don't know the difference between analyzing and evaluating, then you just, you write whatever. Do you know the difference between a bias and a perspective? If someone says, could you form a conjecture? See, if I don't know these terms, and the sad thing is often on provincial exams, I may get tripped up by the question, not the content. I studied, I know the content. I misunderstood what you're asking in the question. It was interesting today when I asked how many kids don't really understand what an inference is. And even high school teachers saying, yeah, they often don't really understand that. Well, then sometimes we need to slow down and unpack, what makes a sound versus weak inference, what makes a difference between observation and inference. So there's a lot of language of thinking that we can get tripped up on if we're not careful. The fourth tool I mentioned thinking strategies. And by the way, I should mention as I go through these, the tools need to be owned by the learners. I think teachers often see them as tools that I'm going to use to teach. But really, our goal in nurturing agency over time is that students start to have a bank of their own thinking strategy. So when they encounter a problem, they can say, oh, this is a good time for me to use a Venn diagram to help me this strategy to be used. So we want to build students' comfort with these strategies. The fifth tool, and it's different than the other 4, are habits of mind. These are the habits of good thinkers, being curious and paying attention to detail and being collaborative in your thinking. And so how do we nurture the habits of good thinkers? And to be quite frank, in most provinces, unfortunately, we reference them in our curriculum, but we don't evaluate them very well, and we don't report on them very well. And yet they're often one of the most important pieces if you're going to be successful. Perseverance, for example, is a habit of mind. And much of the research shows it's one of the most important. You want to succeed in life? Perseverance is going to be one of the number one things. Right? I want to just back up for a moment. Background knowledge, I mentioned, is an absolute pillar, and it's important in our work that we don't, when we start talking about inquiry, that people don't think it's discovery, because we are definitely not about discovery learning. Here's a question, go out and explore, and you'll eventually arrive at an answer. No, they won't. And so what I'm always important to say to teachers, what teachers do really matters in classrooms, because we help build the background knowledge. it's also important we understand, as a teacher, I don't teach answers. I teach the intellectual tools you need to reach your own answer, which means I
Right.
will teach content, but not to answer the question. That's your job.
Hmm.
The other piece I want to be careful of, building background knowledge doesn't mean park the thinking. Well, I fill in all the details, then we'll come back to the thinking. So one
Right.
of the challenges is, how do we teach content knowledge? How do we build content knowledge or background knowledge in a way that invites thinking? How do we
Hmm.
ensure that every day in my class, thinking is what happens here, and it will happen, and even as I'm building content knowledge? So one of the things I will try to do in the next day with the group I'm working with is just offering, here's a dozen ways I can teach content through a thinking approach.
Right.
So we want to find a way that I understand. I need to build your understanding of science, of history, of math concepts, and so on. But I need to engage you in thinking while you learn about it. Because we know from lots of research that if you're engaged in thinking when you're learning, you're more likely to retain what you were learning. It is
Absolutely.
harder to transfer into long-term memory information I merely tried to memorize. So
Yeah.
that's the real challenge, background knowledge built through a thinking approach.
Right. And I mean, I love the word, it rang true to my ears, is that engagement part. And I think that we see that more as kids move up in their schooling, right? From elementary to high school, we know that engagement decreases quite a bit. Um, how do you activate that thinking in the higher level high schools when you are faced with, you have to cover these things so that they they pass this, they get their mark on the test? How can that mindset shift a little bit so that there is more engagement, or I feel like I can bring more engagement in if I do these certain strategies or these criterias?
Yeah. So first of all, one of the things we need to keep in mind, and I'll give you an example of this in a second. It is
Mhm.
an inherently more interesting way to learn, to be invited to think, than it is to simply memorize. And my
Right.
best proof of that, when I ask people, "Have you ever been to an escape room?"
Hmm.
And 2/3 of my audience put that, "Yeah, I've been to an escape room." I said, "So you paid money to be locked in a room, have to think your way out of it."
Right.
That doesn't prove that, the human brain likes to solve puzzles. We like to be invited to think. And yet often in schools, we don't invite the thinking until the end. First, I have to fill your head with content.
Hmm.
Think about video games. Video
Yep.
games, you start playing and you figure it out as you go. You think your way through. And if you get stuck, you go find it and you come back. If school were a video game, nobody would want to play, because we'd say, no, 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 you can't try the game until you finish reading the manual.
Right.
Right?
No
Well,
starting over either, right? No retries. No,
yeah,
like,
exactly. Hit that
yeah,
reset button and away you go. So how do we
that's
do
it.
that in classrooms? Like, how do we seize on what we see as models that are, gaming, they're brilliant. I mean, you start with a manageable place for people to get into the game, and then you
Yeah.
up the challenge as they go. And
Yeah.
so, and by the way, I received a message this week. I'm doing a talk in Brandon at the end of the week, and they
Mm.
said, heads up, a lot of our high school teachers believe that kids can't think until you first fill their head with information, and you need to help us try to change that. So
Yeah.
we call this a learning launch,
Mm.
and it's not a minds on. It's more than that. I'll give you a quick example.
Mhm.
Grade 7 science teacher was about to start learning. Kids are going to start learning about the organ systems in the human body. So our learning launch was to ask, is Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy, is Groot more plant or animal? Okay.
Mm.
And we gave kids a dashboard. So it's not a binary. Notice the question wasn't, is he a plant or is he an animal? That doesn't get me where I want. Is he more plant or animal? Because he's got a bit of both. Is he
Right.
way more plant, somewhat more animal, way more animal? Kids took a
Mm.
position. Why do you think that? Okay, let's explore the respiratory system. And they learned about it. Okay, does Groot have a respiratory system? And
Mm.
well, yeah, he's got a voice and you need a voice box to da, da, da. So we're teaching the content. Well, let me tell you a bit more about our digestive system. And we talk about it. Okay, does Groot have one? By the way, the engagement of the kids, and we gave them that space to go back and forth on that dashboard. They debated like they were hooked. So
Wow.
if we can find a way to get the excitement going first and say, well, what if I told you this? Would that change your mind? What if you
Yeah.
learned this? Right.
Right.
So
Right.
using a learning launch, that's a shift we're really working on with teachers to say, that interesting, provocative question, ask it first. Don't
Right.
save it.
Right.
And be okay with kids saying, I really don't know right now. That's okay, because we're going to get into this. I
Right.
think, another example of that, where do teachers tend to put their field trips in a unit? And I can tell you the vast majority at the end of the unit, like some kind of reward, you
Mm-hmm.
behave, I'll take you on a field trip. That should
Right.
be the first thing.
Mm.
Go out and ask questions,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
get out there and wonder and come on back and we'll explore together. So I
Right.
think there are ways we can raise engagement by not making the most interesting part of our unit towards the end, use it as the hook, get kids into it. And we see pretty consistently when we invert things. By the way, that's another little tweak. Do you know how many
Mm-hmm.
times I see teachers, you have a fascinating task, but you've saved it for the end. What if we made it the beginning? Quick
Right.
example. Math teacher had kids at the end of a linear relations unit, grade 9 or 10, solve a murder mystery. We said,
Mm.
what if that was the start? And so we wrote this up. The first, 20 minutes, kids are introduced at 6:20 this morning. A body was found. We have 3 suspects. We need you to figure out the time of day and which suspect most likely committed based on, a little bit. Then the kids were told, well, the liver temperature when the body was found was this. Here's the data set around the decline in liver temperature after death. Using linear relations, calculate the likely time of death. Then they looked at eye pressure. Like the kids had this ongoing debate about the time of death and who probably committed the murder, applying the math.
Wow.
They were
That's amazing.
so engaged in it.
Yeah.
I want you to note, normally, or in the past, that same activity was at the end of the unit, not the beginning. And
Mm.
the impact it had by moving it up front. So sometimes with teachers, that's an easy little tweak. Can you
Yeah.
make the challenge the start, not the end? And you
Right.
got kids hooked.
Yeah, I like that idea of hooking them, and relating, letting their experience kind of sing a little bit, as they're struggling with the thinking process, and um,
Exactly.
at least they have something they can hem it onto, rather than like, textbook stuff where it's like, yeah, whatever, it's words off a page to me. But you actually bring their lives into play, like every kid seen Groot and thought about, probably thought of, he grows like a tree, but he's kind of human. And like, yeah, that's a really cool example.
So, well, I want to flip this just for a moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So there are the benefits for the kids. There's no question. We see their engagement is up, the depth of their learning is enhanced because they're thinking about it.
Hmm.
But I think we shouldn't lose sight of, and I just made the teacher's job easier. Because if you save everything till the end, and I've got a week left in this unit, and I'm supposed to give feedback and help kids learn, I'm trying now to give feedback to the 30 kids in my class, all in the same week. I only have so much time. Well, imagine if I put that question up front, we've got a month in this unit. Every time I teach a lesson, I'm checking in. How are you applying that? I have way more time. It's a lot calmer for me. A lot of this will happen in my class, in the lesson itself. It's not happening at my kitchen table anymore. It's now the assessment is built into my lesson. And what we find, and this is coming from teachers, their kids are more engaged, their learning's deeper, and the teachers will say, and my life's easier. I'm able to give more meaningful feedback in a more timely way without taking it all home. And they often will say, this was good for me. And I think
Right.
that's another important piece, that it's good for kids, but it's also good for teachers. It's a more efficient way for them to provide the kind of guidance that we should be providing kids.
Absolutely. Fascinating. Fascinating. I'm so happy that we're going to keep this conversation going on Wednesday, Garfield, because we'll be seeing you. I love it. I mean, I love that idea too of coming kind of back to it a bit, of just those tweaks and little tweaks, like just move that in the forefront and use that question as your guide as you go through. Um, Such a powerful idea. Any teacher could do it,
Yeah.
but it's like believing that it is going to have an effect on the kids. And oftentimes, when I go into classrooms and I work with teachers, coaching them, they always are amazed at seeing their kids in a different way, or seeing them where they didn't anticipate they would go, because they've always just kind of gone down their alley, like they just stay on there instead of doing those small little tweaks that can have a profound effect on kids.
Yeah. I also think it's respectful to teachers that
Hmm.
there's a lot of good stuff going on in our classrooms. I mean, I think sometimes, when I get outside of Canada and I'm working with schools internationally, you're reminded, like, we have a very good education system. There's a lot
Mhm.
of good stuff happening. Can we get better? Absolutely. But I think being respectful to teachers, like let's build on top of the good work you're doing. This isn't to displace the work you're doing. You
Yeah.
began the conversation saying, like, how do we make sure that we're honoring the work the teachers are already doing and adding to it and not displacing it? Because
That's
if
it.
I go in and say to teachers, basically scrap everything you're doing, A, it's offensive, and B, the workload just went through the roof, and
Yeah.
they're not going to buy in. So I think this approach of tweak and fortify, add these small pieces, is saying build off the good work you're doing. Let's find ways to make it even better.
Amazing. Let's leave it at that. What a way to end. Awesome. Awesome
Great.
statement. Well, this has been fascinating. I'm gonna go head back into that book after this to look at a few more of the ideas behind it. But I really, really appreciate your time today, Garfield, and sharing some of your ideas. And again, I really look forward to our continued collaboration.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you.